weekend? Yeah? What you do, what you get into? What you get into this? All right, we are in personality. We're still looking at the individual, right? A lot of the layers and dynamics that make up behavior, right? We're thinking of thoughts and feelings and how they're manifested into behavior, looking at patterns, characteristics, things of that nature. So with personality, what makes you you, right? Outside of maybe a ton of external forces that are primarily social, which can alter your behavior, which we'll look at next week. We want to fundamentally understand what makes you do what you do. Right? So we have to start at the beginning with the definition. Definition is, what is your definition of personality? Someone says, hey, that person's personality. What do you think?
It's like a character. It's what makes a person different from another person.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Say, it's something that makes an individual different from another, right? You can say qualities, you can say characteristics. You know, if you're playing a video game and you're using a character, right, what about that character is unique? Why did you choose that particular character for whatever reason that you wanted to choose that individual? So we say it's qualities and characteristics, but it's primarily a pattern, right? It's a consistent pattern of qualities and characteristics over truly the lifespan for the most part. So now you think, how do we get here? How do you have this wonderful personality that drives you? Well, drive is a big word that we'll be using as we start off with Freud. Who here is familiar with Freud? Slightly, right? So we must be familiar with Freud. Freud is first, right? So Freud is the grandfather of all psychology, primarily speaking, right? Freud had a couple partners with him, Carl Jung, maybe we'll discuss him later, and Adler as well too. So if you ever hear about Jungian theories or the Adler school of psychology, things of that nature, those are Freud's sort of colleagues and counterparts. Now Freud was a medical doctor, not a psychologist, because really the field hadn't been really invented in any kind of scientific way. So Freud believed that he can cure individuals of mental illnesses, right? So Freud identified that we have illnesses in the mind just like we would in the rest of our bodies, right? We would have viruses of the mind, in some sense, diseases of the mind. Freud believed that we could be cured. Now we kind of more understand that there's really no curing of mental health issues, mental illnesses we can manage and cope, right? So we begin off at the beginning, where we say, all right, we are born, right? We're born to parents, hopefully both, you know, who are present. If not, primarily it's mother, usually taking care of the baby. And what is going to happen in the environment that's going to drive the baby, right? And also does the baby have, the infant have drives on its own, right? Impulses to be driven to do certain things. So let's start here. So we say, hey, personality, individual characteristics, patterns, thinking, feeling, and acting, right? First you may have feelings before you think, and then actions form, or you may think, and as a result of your thinking, you feel some type of way, and then you act, right? So we say personality is really this entire pattern of how do you think? How do you go about thinking about things? And if so, do you think about it in the same way, under the same conditions? Right? Classical perspective. So we said we start off with Freud, psychodynamic theories. So we're saying theories of personalities here, right? Personality is a pretty fluid thing. 8 billion human beings, 8 billion personalities. So it's pretty dynamic, fluid. Then we got some post or neo-Freudian and later psychodynamic dynamic theorists. There's Maslow. We already saw some of Maslow's and his hierarchy of needs. Carl Rogers, some humanistic theories, and more modern contemporary perspectives. Okay, so at the beginning of our lives, we must fundamentally understand what is going on with us. In essence, you have 2 brains. I wouldn't say 2 brains, let's use a different sort of concept. You have 2 minds, right? Mind is different than the brain. Let's say you have 2 minds and they both are driving you, and both are being stimulated by the environment, right? 2 minds used for your survival so that you can continue living in some sort of safe manner, right? And develop and evolve. So we said we have our unconscious mind. And as we look at the image up here, how much of your total self is the unconscious? How much? Put in a percentage. What do you see up there? 70? Who else? Percentage-wise, how much with this iceberg is your unconscious mind? There's 70. Anybody say 80? Right? Who knows? The point is nobody knows. Right? Nobody really knows. But we can say for the most part it's the main driver. So think about that. With the unconscious mind, in essence, we could say the unknowing mind. This mind does not need for you, with your consciousness, to know. There's no requirement for you to be aware, right? So think about it. Your everyday behavior, things that you do, every little second of your life primarily is driven by the unknowing mind, a mind that doesn't need to be aware, the unaware mind. Right? And then at the top we said we have the conscious mind, right? Mostly conscious. We'll see what that does between those 3 factors of id, ego, superego. Okay, so maybe we'll just go directly into id, ego, superego. So we say the id is the unconscious mind or unconscious energy. Energy being driven to you for primarily survival. We could say this is relative to probably all mammals, most sentient beings, that they're being driven towards unconscious things with an unconscious energy for survival, which is hunger, thirst, sexual reproduction, right? Fight or flight, safety, things of that nature. And this unconscious mind is picking up information and energy throughout the environment, right? So you're walking down the street, you think nothing is happening, right? Because you're focused on probably one little small thing, which is maybe what you got to do later or whatever, but you're still walking in a total environment. So it's not as if anything is not happening. Your unconscious mind is picking up energy and information everywhere you go for your survival. If you did not have that, you'd probably be dead already. Right? Without an unconscious mind, you'd be dead in a few days, right? Because you wouldn't be unconsciously picking up information that's required for your survival. All right, at the top we got the conscious mind. Right? Human beings have developed a prefrontal cortex, this part of the brain, and the frontal lobe, that separates us from other animals. That has allowed us to build skyscrapers and electric vehicles and grid systems and artillery, satellites and things of that nature. All right, this one is the big problem solver. High degree of, say, also abstract thinking, right? Creativity, things that helps us create all of the things that we love and enjoy. And in between that, we have what we'll call the preconscious mind, which is outside awareness but still accessible, right? It's outside of our awareness, we're not conscious of it all the time, but still has some accessibility. So Freud, grandfather of all psychology, developed some sort of ideas with these fundamental perspectives on personality: id, ego, superego. So he would describe the unconscious mind as the id, which is in essence that primary driver for sexual reproduction, hunger, thirst, safety, things of that nature, right? Things that can continue the species. And then he said you have your ego, your conscious mind makes peace. It makes peace with the superego. The superego is essentially your internalized ideals of things. In essence, your superego is some form of morality, or value, or principles, or ethics, or constitution about things. It's your ideal perspective on things. So we say pleasure principle when it comes to Freud. Freud thinks that we are primarily driven by pleasure. And if we did not have that ego to create balance, right, we would be hedonistic. We would be seeking out as much pleasure as possible, right? And you may derive pleasure from some very sadistic things, if you really think about it, right? You wouldn't have any limitations. You would do all the drugs you could possibly do till you broke, have as much sex as you probably could. Why? Because it feels wonderful. Eat bad food as much as you could. Why? It tastes great, right? You would do every single thing that would bring you pleasure with no restraint, which would probably inevitably lead to an early demise for yourself. So Freud thought it was essential that we should have an ego to sort of counterbalance that unconscious id, right? That drive to satisfy, that drive for pleasure, which he calls pleasure principle. By principle, we are pleasure creatures. And then with that superego, we have the sort of morality center. The part of our brain that says, you know what, it's probably not a good idea to do a lot of stuff. This is actually bad. The part that gives good or bad to anything you do, or we could say good and evil, right? So you could say the unconscious mind is on your left shoulder as a devil, right? It wants to do everything bad, everything that's pleasurable, everything that says feels great. And you say on your right shoulder is the ego. It's your, on the right shoulder is a superego, right? And that's your angel, right? You say the one where you just really want to do the best possible thing in life to the max, which is impossible, right? Not realistic. And then we say in the middle, you have your brain, right? That center, that ego, that one is going to balance between those two and say, finally, you know what? All right, I don't want to be too bad. I can't be too good. And I don't want to be too bad. So I'll go somewhere in the middle and I'll just regulate it and say, have a medium of some sort. Right? All right, beyond that, since Freud is the grandfather of all psychology, remember Freud's not he was a medical doctor, not a psychologist, because the field hasn't really been invented in a scientific way. Yet, Freud is highly controversial, right? Because Freud does talk a lot about sex, right? But with some sense of validity, right? Because Freud is thinking that as most organisms seek to reproduce, that there's a fundamental design there to reproduce, that he thinks that as human beings we're not really different. And what would make us different than dogs and cats and lions and all these other creatures that seek out to reproduce all the time. But he's a bit controversial because he also talks about childhood sexuality, meaning that we have sexual urges and impulses from birth, right? That it's not something that's just formed prepubescent years or puberty or post-pubescent years as a child. But he thinks that we have motivations and drives that are unconscious. We're not aware of them, right? Eventually we do become aware of them. That influence our personality. So Freud is very famous for that, right? Unconscious motivations to influence personality, dealing with childhood and sexuality, and then discovery of the unconscious mind, and last but not least, free associations, right? Free association is in essence if you were to come talk to me for therapy, some sort of psychoanalytic therapy, I would sit in a chair with a notebook and a pen, and you would lay down on the couch, and you would look up at the ceiling, and I'd say, hey, just talk for the next hour. Just talk. Tell me all your thoughts for the next hour. Just go ahead, and I will remain silent. Right, so Freud would think, like, in that talking of an hour, things would start to emerge from stuff that you said or expressed that was important to be identified of your true unconscious motivations, which means the things you weren't aware of, the things you're not necessarily thinking about. But when you begin speaking, they come out automatically. Because remember we said that unconscious mind holds most of the information, right? You're just not aware of it until maybe you start speaking, and now you've caught up with your conscious mind. So with free association, talk for an hour, things will start to emerge, and then we'll start to see themes and patterns, such as, hey, you mentioned that thing with your mom like 10 times in the past hour, right? You mentioned anxieties about school. You mentioned something maybe you were being bullied as a kid, right? Or even things you may try to not say. Things that I heard you try to get into and you cut it short, right? But, oh, interesting. You didn't want to really talk about that, which means you kind of buried that information for some cope mechanism, which we'll come back to later, right? So that would be free association, drawing out themes and patterns from just free expression of thoughts, from the unconscious mind, so we can make them conscious and try to see what information we can get from there. All right, so Freud says there's a structure to personality, right? The structure is that we have a duality, right? We're constantly being pushed and pulled. And we say in the center of the duality is homeostatic balance, right? Homeostasis. But outside of that, we have to be alive. So there are things in the external environment and even internal sort of environment that are pushing and pulling us constantly. So he says human personality arises from the conflict between impulse and restraint, meaning you have impulse with that unconscious mind, and then you have restraint. So think of this with the impulse and restraint. You can sit in class, right, for any class, and you say, I'm bored. With the impulse, your unconscious mind says, let's do something because I'm bored. Let's see the notifications. Who hit me up on Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. What's going on YouTube? What's in my feed? Let me check the emails. Let me check Facebook, right? Impulse to do it, which means really, it's probably going to happen. Right? And then you say, maybe you catch up a couple seconds later, you're like, oh man, let me pay attention. Restraint, right? So Freud's saying here that we have just this impulse for pleasure, because remember we said boredom is painful, right? And the human mind wants to get away from pain and seek pleasure. So if boredom is painful, our body is going to unconsciously respond and say, oh, this don't feel good, let me do something, right? Think of this. For 1 hour in any class, could you stay without fidgeting in your chair? Without touching your face, right? Without doing anything. Think of that. Just for 1 hour, could it be possible for you to stay very stoic in your chair face forward, pay attention, and don't move. You say, wow, think about that. Even if you really think about it and focus on it, you probably can't do it. But why is that 1 hour of my entire life I wouldn't be able to do that? Why? You just saw that the unconscious mind really has a hold on you. So, if someone ever says, hey, I make my own choices and decisions, and it's just me, for the most part, it sounds very simple, and it doesn't sound to be factual. Think of that. In essence, we are primarily driven by a mind that is, we really don't have control of. Which means that if we look at other people and say, well, who's controlling that person? In a Western society, individualistic society, like, how is your responsibility? It's you. You messed up. Right? Why do you act like that? Right? The person acts like that. It's them. Right? But who is the them? And then would be that individual's balance between impulse and restraint. Maybe they don't have restraint. Therefore they're very impulsive. Right? And maybe they do have restraint. They're very disciplined. They work well within the environment in which they live very well. So for instance, we're trying to resolve this basic conflict, this duality of being impulsive to pleasure, and then restraining ourselves to sort of work well within the environment, right? If the classroom is an environment, you're restraining yourself, right? And so we saw the id, ego, superego. Okay, so personality development. We say, hey, where does your personality come from? Freud thinks, in essence, you are just a giant kid. And no matter if you're 90 years old, 70, 50, 30, 20, Freud believes you just have a big body, right? A more developed sort of brain network, but you still possess primarily all of the essence of your childhood, right? You are really just a big child with an extra layer of adult environment and things dictating the social sort of aspect of yourself. All right, so Freud says that children pass through a series of psychosexual stages, right? Remember, he said primarily driven by impulse, right? Sexual impulse and urge, which he calls the libido, which is your drive, in essence, to reproduce and really make a copy of yourself, which in essence, if you think about it, is not a bad theory, right? You would say the highest sort of thing you could do in life is to procreate, because it's really, you're replicating and creating a copy of yourself to be loved, right? Outside of being a millionaire, billionaire, et cetera, et cetera. All right, and so the id's pleasure-seeking energies focus on distinct pleasure-sensitive areas or erogenous zones. So Freud believed we have energy in certain areas that are condensed, and he'll call those erogenous zones. Erogenous zones, as we understand it now, is really areas where there is a dense amount of neurons, right? That give sensation. Right? So you think of anything that's sensitive. Under your arms is an erogenous zone, right? Obviously, genitalia area is an erogenous zone. Anywhere that there's some high dense sensitivity and pleasure could be derived from. So Freud said there's our energies there, high degree of energies in these areas. Each stage presents challenges or conflicting tendencies. So we're going to go through the stages. There's 4, usually I think described as 5 in a more contemporary sense. In these stages, he says there's challenges. If something goes wrong, or interruption or disruption within these stages, Freud thinks we're going to have a lifelong problem. So in essence, Freud believes, right, or hypothesizes that if you feel that you have an issue, any issue in your life, and one is a pretty sustainable issue, right? An issue that kind of sticks around, it's lingering, it's prolonged. That is usually derived from some sort of disruption in these stages. Something happened in these stages that caused some abnormalities, right? And then he talks about the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex, which we'll kind of go through as we look at the stages. And then with identification, kind of identifying who we are as an individual unit, and also in the context of a social dynamic. And we'll look at fixation too, right? All right, Freud says we have 5 stages, right? That really develop our personality. You see it really, most of it is up to puberty. Only the last one is really adulthood. So he says in the first stage, you are born, right? And your primary sort of area that needs pleasure, that has an impulse or drive for pleasure is your mouth. Right? So in this first stage, we call the oral psychosexual stage. Right? We say you have an impulse to suckle on your mom's breasts to get milk, right? Lactate gives milk, so you have your nutrients. You also have a propensity to use your mouth to cry, to communicate to the world that you need something, that you need attention to be focused on you. You bite things, right, to feel the mouth, feel the textures, hardness, right? You're not using really your hand to feel are things hard and the textures of things. You're using your mouth, right? And then you chew as well too, right? So Freud believed really here the mouth is the main mechanism for dictating your environment and also dictating your own needs. Right? So Freud believes at this stage, if there's any disruption or interruption, meaning that this stage you're sucking on your binky, right? You're sucking on mom's breast. Freud believes that if mom doesn't give you binky quick enough, you're gonna have a problem. Mom gives you binky too fast, you're gonna have a problem, right? If mom doesn't give you her breast quick enough, you're gonna have a problem. She's too slow with it. She lets you just sit there and cry. Problem. Also a crime, right? Mom doesn't react to your crying. She just lets you cry until finally something in your brain clicks that your crying is not worth anything. We're gonna have a problem as an adult, right? Having that binky too much, sucking on the breast for too long. Freud says you're going to have a problem. In which case we say, hey, fixations derive, right? There's a fixation dealing with this particular mechanism, the mouth. So Freud would sort of theorize that if you saw somebody who smokes, right, who smokes cigarettes or vapes, that they had an interruption in this oral phase. So if you see someone smoking, like, interesting, why does this person need to put this contraption into their mouth every day, every few hours, take a smoker's break outside? Freud says something happened in the oral phase. Right? Mom may have breastfed too long. Right? Something of the sort. Been on that binky for too long. A fixation with mouth. Freud would also say, people who slander people and gossip, who use their mouth as a weapon, weaponize their mouth. Right? Big talkers, people who talk crap. that they also have a disruption in this phase, anything dealing with the mouth. Freud said those who participate in oral sex and have a high propensity for that, right? To sort of communicate their pleasure to others with their mouth, had a disruption in the oral phase, right? Freud says anything with the mouth. Hey, do you suck on your thumb? Do you bite on your nails? Like, yeah, I bite my nails down to the nub. Why? It's pleasurable. It's compulsive and pleasurable, like we just said. He believes anything derived from pleasure with the mouth, where there's a fixation, something that's not necessarily healthy for you, that means you have an issue, right? Something happened in the oral phase. And now this has developed that personality of the oral part of you, right? So this person has an oral fixation of some kind. All right, so that's 0 to 18 months. We're only a year and a half in, and Freud says you're gonna be a smoker, a gossiper, right? Participate in a lot of oral sexual participation, right? Freud says you're gonna talk crap a lot, weaponize your mouth. You're gonna chew your nails. You're gonna bite the skin off your nails, right? You're gonna walk around chewing an ink pen because it feels great. Anything to do with the mouth. Now we're at a year and a half, going into 3 years old. We're at the anal phase, right? Potty training. So Freud says now we're at potty training, and now you have to do a basic function of processing through digestion, right, and essentially defecating. The basic function of eating, digestion, and defecation to get rid of waste from your body, right? Universal thing has to be done. Freud believes that there can be an issue here, something that could derive from, we just said, another erogenous zone, pleasure zone. The first one was the mouth. Mouth seeks pleasure. Oh, I forgot to, the other theory would be Freud would say, hey, if you are obese, if you like to eat a bunch of crap, Freud says you have a high degree of propensity that you have an issue, disruption in the oral phase 2. Because once again, you're just seeking ultimate pleasure through the mouth of bad food, knowing that there's an unhealthy consequence. All right, so yes, with anal, he says pleasure focus on bowel and bladder elimination, coping with demands for control. So Freud says, hey, bladder movement, you have to have control of it, right? Which means as a child, you have to be taught the restraint to say, let me know when you need to go potty, right? This is how you plan for potty. This is how you plan to get rid of waste from your body, right? Through genitals and the anus. That's why we have the word anal. Right, so Freud believes that if anything disrupted here, let's say mom didn't potty train you to 4 years, 5 years old. Mom waited too long. Freud says now you have a lack of control over basic function of expulsion of waste. In which case, Freud believes you have a lack of control and order in your life. Right? So Freud would say you're messy. You can't even control your own bowel movements. Bowel movements are messy. Thus your life is messy. Right? So Freud would say, hey, we walk into your room, we see everything laid out on the floor, your room looks a mess. Your life's a mess. Nothing's in order, nothing is planned for, nothing is in control. Freud says, interesting. You had a disruption in the anal phase. Freud says you're a criminal, you're a constant criminal, you have a lack of control and discipline for order. The society says we need order with these rules and laws. You say, forget that. Right? So Freud would even link criminality to anal phase. Now, on the opposite side, we say, hey, you know what, maybe mom potty trained us too quickly, meaning she placed an overemphasis. she overemphasized going to potty, and she was so strict that it disrupted something in us on the flip side. Hence, we have the term anal fixation, or anal. We're like, man, that person's really anal. Like, what do you mean anal? Everything has to be a certain way. Everything has to be in order. I mean, we call that type A personality. Right? Everything has to be a certain way. Everything has to be super neat, right? Which means they also have a fixation with the erogenous zone of anal sort of fixation, right? And we would say that person's really stressed when things are not in order. So there's going to be an issue there too. One, we just saw an issue with being messy, right? We call anal expulsive, right? Very messy. Even criminality, right? A lack of order and discipline. On the other side, we say some people are anal retentive, right? A compulsion and obsession to be super ordered, right? And usually life can't be super ordered because we live around other people, right? Time and other phenomena that can disrupt that. Thus, Freud would say you would have anxiety because of that. You will suffer a lifelong stress because you seek to have perfection and order in your life just off of potty training. Potty training is way too quick. It should overemphasize potty training. Before he said there's a healthy balance, right? A healthy space. And then next we have phallic, right? So 3 to 6 years old. All right, pleasure zone is the genitals coping with incestuous sexual feelings. Right? 3 to 6 years old. So Freud would say, hey, you know what? You have a brother or a sister in the household, maybe around the same age. Maybe you take baths together. You finally start to be aware that you have genitals. Right? You may touch them, interact with them. Maybe you'll look at your siblings' genitals if you take a bath or naked together somewhere, running around playing. And Freud would say you would start to be more aware of the fact, right? And now Freud says, you know what? If you were to engage in your own touching of, say, yourself, and really identify how pleasurable it is, because once again, genital areas and erogenous zone, high degree of pleasure, right? Centered on a high degree of condensed neurons, sensitivities. Freud would say you will begin to have a fixation, right? Either with others' genitals or yours. So if mom and dad did not regulate that behavior to say, stop playing with your genitals, stop touching other people's, right? Could be siblings, or someone in the family, you know. If that behavior is not managed, Freud would say, you know what, for the most part, you're probably going to have a genital problem, a sexual problem as you get older. All right? You're going to use that area as, once again, just like the oral, as a mechanism to communicate to the world. Your major form of expression as a personality is through your genitals. That you could be very promiscuous, having a ton of sex, unrestrained, right? You may use that to weaponize, to maybe get people to do what you want to do, maybe, you know, all sorts of manipulation tactics sexually. You could be pedophilic, right? Freud would theorize that you would have pedophilic tendencies. Freud would theorize you could become a sexual predator. Freud would theorize that possibly you become a rapist, right? Freud would say there was a disruption or an interruption in this phase dealing with the genitals. Now you have a fixation on others' genitals and primarily using yours as a weapon to communicate expressions of unreleased energies. Remember, once again, Freud says these zones have high degree of energy. And Freud says if these energies are pent up, they are stressful and need to be released. If they're not released, you are feeling tense, and there's a drive and motivation to release that tension. So he would say, why does poor behavior happen with a sexual predator constantly doing the bad stuff, even if they've been caught, even if they serve time? What is this tendency to keep drive towards the behavior? Freud says, you know what? Yeah, we put him in jail, we put him or her in jail, they serve the time. You would think that the behavior would change. Freud says, no, we're missing something. Okay? That this, in essence, can only be positively managed, hopefully managed, right? Restrained. But the impulse is probably still there. Freud says it's probably a permanent impulse, right? Because of childhood. All right, and then, incestuous behavior. Even when we're doing like Oedipus complex and Electra complex, who's familiar with an Oedipus complex or Oedipus complex? Everyone? Who knows what an Oedipus complex is? Anybody? All right, we could say a son's sexual desire for his mom, right? Kind of a sexual impulsive desire for his mom, right? Freud says this is something that is more common than you think, right? Sounds weird in the conscious, but we focus and aware on it, but he says it doesn't, not too uncommon in the unconscious mind, right? Which means that particularly if mom has been too overbearing and too kind of loving in some sense, we could develop some sort of sexual drive for mom. Or if dad has, we see the dynamics of the power of the father within the family system, that the daughter would gravitate towards the dad's in some sexual way. Not in essence of really saying mom or dad really as the object of desire, but more so the idea of mom or dad, right? In that some sort of way. So Freud would theorize this, and this is probably one that's pretty common. Freud would theorize that if you heard a lot of women engaging in sexual activity, and during the course of sex, that they use the word daddy, poppy, daddy. Freud said that is an unconscious impulse and reflex. Sexual one that may have happened during phallic stage. Freud would also say that if you hear men describe their female counterparts' romantic interest as mom, that could be an unconscious thing as well too, right? He would theorize such things. All right, and then we hit first grade. All right, when we hit first grade, latency. You say the switch shuts off. We shut off the switch of these sort of sexual drives. Now we're in first grade, we're not even paying attention to it no more. It kind of goes dormant, right? Which is why you don't see a lot of sort of sexual behavior with elementary age students. Maybe later in like the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. But like between first and fifth grade, you'll usually see a lot of issues or stories deriving from there. Because Freud hypothesized that, well, in essence, the mind kind of shuts down for sexual feelings and interests past that, right? So latency to puberty. Before it says, well, you know what, at the tail end of that, puberty, we start to develop the hormones and the physiological changes that create the ability to reproduce. So finally, we could actually reproduce and create a copy of ourselves in some way, right? So once again, the sexual interest at the end, tail end of that is back on. And then Freud says genital stage, puberty on maturation of sexual interest, right? Which would say your age, right? You're past puberty, and now there's a maturity of sexual interest, which means you probably regulate a lot of these things with that kid. You're making better decisions and choices, a little bit more restrained. If you were unrestrained, you probably wouldn't even be in school. Could have 10 kids and be doing a bunch of stuff, right? Or debilitating diseases or whatnot. All right, so that's it. We'll stop here. We'll come back more on some humanistic theories, some personality, and we'll look at some more on Maslow's as well. And then, who's our last group? We got one more group to come in, or is that it? I know we got Will, who sits here. He's gonna present.